unpour the tea, the opposite. Okay, so now I have stats around 50 miles per hour for pouring the tea and the opposite of pouring the tea using my normal grip alignment, which is from B to 2. So now what if I go from A to 2, align the disc there, so instead of from here to there, from there and still through the middle groove. So this gives my index finger more reach, and it's what I used to do before I found out you're not supposed to do that. But I didn't have the tech disc then, so I'm going to still pour the tea though, so we can compare pouring the tea between those two different alignments. So now instead of using dynamic wrist supination to turn the key like that, what if I start out with as much supination as I can do, and I hold it like that, and I do not try to pour the tea, and I just keep this my normal grip with this max supination maintained the whole time. Let's see what that does. Okay, holding max supination with my normal grip and no pouring the tea or anything else. So far it slipped out early twice while doing this, so I'm going to try to grip a little harder. Okay, so conclusions from the tests in this video and building on what we saw in the last video. But first, just a couple warnings. These tests are not extremely precise, so it's not totally conclusive, but I definitely think the data is pointing us in the right direction. And then, as I mentioned before, if you've got much bigger problems in your form, like you're doing a huge nose-up swoop, you got to work on that first before trying some advanced techniques like turning the key, or even simple stuff like pouring the tea is not going to get you nose down until you get those things under control. Okay, so in the last video, I made the somewhat controversial claim that pouring the tea is overrated, and I still stand by that, but there's a clarification. If you're trying to get below 0 nose angle, then that's where I think pouring the tea is overrated, because there are other techniques that feel much easier to get a lot more nose down. I mean, they're difficult, they're harder to implement, but I was able to implement them pretty quickly. Whereas pouring the tea feels like you're very capped at what you're able to do. You can do this, and then that's it. You can't really do it harder or more. But in this video, we can see that pouring the tea was helpful compared to not pouring the tea, or doing the opposite, unpouring the tea, which would be radial deviation. And so pouring the tea was almost an improvement of 3 degrees of nose angle compared to not doing it at all. And surprisingly though, doing the opposite of pouring the tea was almost the same as simply not pouring the tea. And I think it's just because it's an awkward position, and so it's difficult to maintain, so I was probably losing it and reverting to just not pouring the tea. And as you accelerate the disc into the power pocket, you're creating more force to push the disc down from the momentum and the weight of the disc, but also from the wind drag. So it's probably why I'm losing some of it and we're not seeing more nose up. And then in the last video, I talked about where, when you look at the release angle being out here, if you're trying to throw, not release angle, but where the release happens, when you're trying to throw towards the camera, the disc is spinning out. Pouring the tea doesn't quite look like it's nose down compared to supination. But we are kind of in like an in-between space here where it's not clearly the nose or it's not clearly hyzer. So I think that's why pouring the tea does still seem to help, at least getting closer to nose neutral. And then for the other test where I changed my grip alignment, and it seems like it did increase, my nose went up a couple degrees while doing that. And then thinking about turning the key from the last video and how that was giving me a lot of nose down, and I'm calling that a dynamic movement, as in it's a sudden change. We're suddenly doing something, compared to pouring the tea. I call that static. We're just keeping it there and not changing it. Generally, that's what people do. So my thought was, well, if supination is bringing the nose down, then what if I just hold the supination the whole time instead of turning the key, keep it already turned? And that seemed to suck. It didn't help. I got quite a bit of nose up, 3.5 at least for me. That's a decent amount of nose up. So it's not, and this goes kind of similar to kind of similar to the opposite of pour the tea. I think it's just simply hard to maintain. So if I supinate like this, I can pull through with it, but once I start coming out to the hit, we're now getting a lot of acceleration out here. That's going to be pushing the weight of the disc more down and the wind drag, so I'm probably losing the supination and getting nose up, going more towards pronation. And so that's why I think some of these dynamic movements, like turning the key or the inverted swoop from the last video, are effective, is because when you do it dynamically and explosively, you're able to overcome those forces. Whereas when you try to hold it, it's hard to maintain when those forces increase. So that leads me to think, well, what about dynamically pouring the tea? Trying to pour the tea suddenly, will that be better than just pouring the tea statically? So I'll try to test that soon. One more final thought here. So dynamically turning the key, going from pronation to supination at the last moment, is giving you a lot of nose down. So the opposite, going into pronation at the last moment, gives you a lot of nose up. And I wonder if some people are accidentally increasing the chance that they pronate by following the advice of pressing, of using a lot of thumb pressure, which is, I think, generally good advice. I follow it, but it depends on where your thumb is. I put my thumb generally like in the middle of where the flight plate and the rim meet, or slightly more towards the flight plate. But if you put your thumb deeper in, and if I press it hard, it's pushing the disc down this way, and I feel that tension. And one way to make it more comfortable and relieve some of that tension is to pronate my wrist. It's a lot more comfortable now. It's easier to hold with that pressure. Whereas if I put that same thumb pressure closer to where the flight plate and the rim meet, I don't feel as much. I still feel tension in the wrist just from pressing, but I don't feel it as if someone is pushing the disc this way and making my wrist want to pronate.